suffering challenges your faith in a way that other things just don't. And that is why we can end up with a deconstructed faith, one that we feel like doesn't make sense anymore. It doesn't fit together. In the context of our suffering, Jesus died on the Friday, and then the Saturday is a strange place, isn't it, of nothingness. And I wonder if that's a helpful image of our suffering, because sometimes we get stuck in the Saturday and the redemption comes the following day on the Sunday with the resurrection. Even though the Saturday sometimes feels so long, it's worth rumbling with your story so that you can come out the other side and eventually Sunday will come.
Welcome to the Upside Down People podcast. As always, I'm your host, Caleb, and if you're wanting to show your support for the show, leave us a rating, leave us a review, or share the show with your family and friends. So the conversation we're having today is with Dr. Katherine Thompson. We're talking about framing suffering in light of the gospel. Katherine is an accredited mental health social worker and a member of the Australian College of Social Workers. She is a lecturer in mental health and wellbeing at Melbourne School of Theology, Eastern College, Australia. In 2019, her book Christ-Centered Mindfulness, A Connection to Self and God, was announced the co-winner of both the Martin Institute for Christianity and Culture and Dallas Willard Research Center Book Award. Katherine provides a wealth of insight and knowledge into this space of mental health, which has its fingerprint on so many different lives living in Western culture. And she brings to the conversation not just her expertise and experience in the mental health area, but she brings the grace of the gospel and the good news that's found in the gospel that we can apply to our pain and to our suffering. It's a wonderful conversation. It's an encouraging conversation. Let's dive into it. I'm just so excited and privileged to be able to have a conversation with you today, Katherine. So welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Caleb.
How has your day started off today?
Yeah, well, I've been deep in my academic writing for a course next year, so thinking about mental health topics as usual. So It's been interesting, actually. Yeah.
Right. What's the? Am I allowed to ask what the course is on?
Yeah, I work for Melbourne School of Theology, Eastern College, and we're starting a Master of Youth Mental Health and Wellbeing next year. And so for people that work with young people that want to integrate faith, wellbeing and mental health knowledge together, because that's often a struggle for Christians that work with young people to try and integrate everything. And it's going to be exciting. So we're trying something completely new.
Yeah, that's very cool. So obviously you specialize in this area of mental health and well-being. I'm really curious, how did you come to specialize in this?
I was very fortunate when I started my first job after I finished my PhD when I was in my 20s. I worked at a place that is one of the world's innovators in youth mental health. In fact, youth mental health was invented in Melbourne in Australia. I don't know if you realise that,
No.
But the whole concept around young people and needing to realise that they have special needs for their mental health and wellbeing really originated in Australia. And it's now been over my lifetime and my work life, it's been sort of carried across the world and developed. So now we have other countries that also have that discipline and focus. And the reason why it's important is because 75% of mental health disorders actually occur in people between 15 and 25 years. So it's actually a mental health specialty area now, because what we need to know to help young people is very different to what we would use for adults.
Yeah, right. What would be the main differences between those different demographics?
Yeah, so young people were traditionally, they sort of got to 18 and our mental health services used to fall off a cliff then. You'd end up thrown into the adult mental health system if you needed care. And it just didn't really fit for young people for lots of reasons because they're in a different developmental life stage. So now we sort of tend to bridge it either depending on what state in Australia you live in.
Right.
Your mental health service might go from little kids all the way up to 25, or you might be fortunate to live in a catchment that has a specialty 15 to 25-year-old service, and sometimes there's a mix of both. So, yeah, it's quite interesting, actually.
Yeah. What I suppose, what do you find most fulfilling about doing this research and engaging in this practice of yours?
Yeah. So the reason why I work with young people, so 2 days a week I do mental health treatment and counselling with young people, and the other half of the week I'm sort of being an academic and trying to teach in that area. And the reason why I have a passion for it actually is because young people have such a potential to grow and learn and enthusiasm for life. And I think the impact you can have with helping them can have a lifelong impact on the rest of what ends up happening to them. And I think there's optimism there, and I love working in that space. I love the challenge of it.
That's awesome. And I think it's definitely well needed. I was reading recently that suicide was the main cause of death in Australia in 2019 between the ages of 15 and 49 or 50. So obviously there's a massive epidemic for mental health, and that people are clearly struggling with depression, anxiety, grief, burnout, illness, disability. So there's all these different factors, including the social factors as well, like especially with young people, like social media and that. So I think it's like very much needed. So I do admire the work that you do and the work that others in your field do as well. I think, yeah, if it's causing that much pain and suffering and disconnection in society, it definitely we need more people to invest their time and resources into it.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so I'm really excited to talk about your book and sort of tease out a few ideas and thoughts that you have in there, the discipline of suffering, because I think it's so relevant, obviously, to what your field is and what we've just been talking about with mental health. What's sort of initially led you to writing this book?
I guess my perception of what's available in a Christian bookstore about suffering is all these well-meaning, and they're quite well-written books about the intellectual side of what suffering's like. And whilst they're great on a thinking level, there's a real disconnect, I think, between reading about suffering and then knowing how to apply that knowledge to your life as a Christian. And what I wanted to do with the book is to create something new, because from my age downwards, so anyone younger than me, we tend to think in a more postmodern way. Okay. And so the traditional Christian books really don't offer us anything that we relate to, because they're from a modern framework. Right. So postmodernism uses things like story and music and lots of creative means of trying to communicate what's important to you and who you are. And I think that in some ways it's a missed opportunity in the church that we haven't grabbed hold of the positive parts of postmodernism and used them to share our stories about how we became Christians and to communicate with people. So the book sort of uses story as a way of trying to understand how does suffering impact how we see ourselves and God, and how can we sort of not get stuck there and actually move and grow in a positive way and come out with some growth in our character so that we change and become better people, that God can redeem the difficulties that we're going through rather than just being stuck in the mess and pain of what we're going through.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I think part of that, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but part of that postmodernism as well is that thought of deconstructing worldviews or stories and narratives, and you go a bit into that into your book as well, because that's not something that's, I suppose, talked about a lot. Is like we have these stories, we have these ideas of who we are or our lives, and we just take it as that's it. There's no critical thought into actually you can start pulling it apart and find out the reasons why that is and then reconstruct it afterwards.
Yeah, I think we get scared about this idea of deconstructing things because we think that then we'll just end up with all the bits of our faith in pieces on the ground and we can't put it back together.
Yeah.
I was conscious of it this week at work in chapel. We were talking about the process of going through theological education, and that forces people to deconstruct their faith, and you hope by the end of the degree you put the pieces back together again.
Yeah.
So, because it's challenging you, and I think suffering challenges your faith in a way that other things just don't. And that is why we can end up with a deconstructed faith, one that we feel like doesn't make sense anymore, it doesn't fit together. But then having got to that place, the problem, I think, is that if we don't have tools to rebuild or reconstruct how we understand ourselves and God, then we're in all sorts of trouble. So I wanted through the book to give people a chance to see that there are tools available. You can work with your thinking and with how you see the story of your life and what sort of life you want, and reconstruct that with God's help.
Yeah, very good. And in your book, you've categorized it quite neatly, I thought, into 4 different parts. You got myths, and then moves into dreams, and then narratives and stories. I thought that was really neat because it's almost like it starts with things that are unreality, and it moves to firming up something to reality and like a new story, that redemption. I don't know if that was your intent, but I was like, it follows a very logical line of thought. I loved it.
Yeah, that's really good. I think too that I wanted to just really attack some of the silly thinking that we have around suffering and the crazy stuff we say to each other, which is unhelpful. And then to move people to, as you say, like to a positive place by the end of the book.
Yeah.
And what I did, which was very generous of the people that I interviewed, I actually found people that I deeply respected that have a deep faith, that have gone through this deconstruction, reconstruction of their faith because of some difficult thing that they struggled with in their life. And ask them questions about what they thought about parts of it. So if you track them through the book, you can actually see their process of deconstruction, reconstruction in how I interviewed them, which I find is really encouraging. Well, it was to me interviewing them. I'm pretty sure people reading the book will find something in their stories that they relate to.
I thought it was really, really amazing how you did that. I think it took me, I'm not the brightest person, so it took me a few chapters to realize it was following the stories of the same people, because sometimes it would end quite abruptly in suffering and in pain. And I was like, I think the human in me is just like, I want to know what happens. I want to like see the positive, or like, is the story resolved? And I think one of the things as well, which I learned from the book, is like it's all right to sit in that place as well. So you've almost taken people on this journey through others' lived experiences of pain and suffering, and brought it all the way through. So I thought, I haven't seen that done before. I thought it was really helpful. And like you said, the stories in there's ministry burnout, same-sex attractive for children there. So it's going over like a plethora of different different issues that people are like suffering, that people are experiencing, grief and loss. And I think, you've done an incredible job at that. There's no doubt about that. I think it was amazing. So you've mentioned that you started off by wanting to pull apart and just expose some of to use your language, the myths that Christians hold about suffering. Do you mind just maybe sharing a few that you find particularly dangerous that we hold?
Just choose the obvious one, Caleb, that really gets under people's skin. Is if you go up to a Christian that's been devastated by something in their life and you start quoting the passage out of Romans that says all things work together for good.
Yeah, right.
It is the equivalent of rubbing salt into an open wound. And I know that verse is true and actually is important as well. But if we quote things like that to people in an insensitive way, it can really pull them down because they're already suffering and probably have doubts about things. And to say that is a bit like invalidating their pain.
Right.
And it's quite hurtful. And that's one example of the things that I say, let's stop doing that. That's not really helpful to people. We'd do better just to walk with them silently through their suffering and not offer stupid advice that makes us feel better, but doesn't help the person that's in the situation.
Yeah, it's an amazing point that you make, that we do that because we're trying to make ourselves feel better, and we end up doing a lot more hurt or damage to the person that we want to try and come alongside. Why do you think we are inclined that way?
Honestly, I think sometimes we don't know what to say to people. So it's not like we intend to hurt them.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's because we're uncomfortable with whatever their problem is. We don't want to deal with that. I think that in our culture, we sort of have this idea that we shouldn't suffer. And I think that's another part of it, that it goes against our culture's view that we should be happy. And it also goes against the flow of our church's idea. I use church with a capital C. Collectively, our idea of that Christians have got to have it all together, that we're somehow now changed and we're all okay.
Yeah.
I really think that's a realistic view of what the Christian life is like, because Jesus talks about taking up our cross every day as a choice. That's not about just being happy all the time.
No, not at all. It's quite the opposite, right? The cross is not a pleasant symbol by any means.
No.
Yeah. Why do you think we have this feeling that we have the right to happiness in our culture, or the right to be protected from adversity? And why do you think it's important that we need to deconstruct that view and almost settle within ourselves that suffering and pain are, for lack of better words, are a part of life?
Well, Jesus himself said that in this life we'll have trouble, and that's definitely true. Eventually it catches up with us. We'll experience it at some point in our life. I think sometimes what's often very common, doesn't matter what culture you live in, if we sort of assimilate our faith in God into our cultural values without realizing it. We fail to separate the two out. And I think that Jesus came to challenge culture. He often challenged it in very uncomfortable ways,
right,
with teaching. And I don't think the gospel, the good news that he brought, was meant to be comfortable. And I think that if we just swallow what our culture says that we're meant to be like, that's a real superficial fault of our own, that we need to at some point, even if we are not Christians, to think about that, because we need to work out what do we want our life to be based on. And if we base it on the teachings of Jesus, then that really confronts some of the things that are automatically assumed in our Australian cultural setting. Things like needing to be happy, things like, well, do we really have to have all those material possessions that we're told we need, which put huge pressure on people. Like, part of the reason why we've got a cost of living crisis, aside from the economic issues, is because we all think we need a house. And the cost of our mortgages is just like really strangling a lot of us at the moment.
Yeah.
And what does Jesus teach about that? He says, don't worry about all these material things. He says, seek first the kingdom of God and righteousness, and then he promises that all these other things will be taken care of. Yeah. He doesn't mean that we're going to be rich. He's just saying, look, your priorities are meant to be the other way around.
Right. Yeah. And you talk about that in the book as well, about how this Western constructed dream is broken, essentially, or the dream of what it means to live the good life is essentially broken. And when I was thinking about that, I was like, it's so true. But I can definitely relate to wanting to have something, but then, so you desire something good, but then you do what you know isn't good. So it's that there seems to be a disconnection between our desires and our actions. And I was reminded of Paul talks in Romans 7, that he says, like, I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing that I hate. And I think you use the example in the book about Solomon, how he explains that sex outside of a long-term committed relationship is damaging to both our character and our overall well-being. Yet he had 700 concubines, so it seems like there's this like disconnection between like our desires, wanting to do what's good and helpful, but then our actions like don't align with that. Why do you think that might be?
I think it takes effort to reflect, to try and line up the values that we want for our life with how we actually live it out. And I think to be a healthy person, you need to line up your values with how you're actually living. There can't be a disconnect between the two. And as Christians, we can only understand the mind of God. I don't know if that's a good way to put it, but it's an easy way to understand, by reading the Bible and really immersing ourselves in it, because then we understand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you as a practitioner as well, how do you, like, knowing exactly what you said, that there's goodness to the Bible and aligning our mind with the mind of God, how do you go about like helping someone who doesn't have those same values or is a non-Christian?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would actually use this same method regardless, and I would get the person to think about, in different areas of my life, what is important to me? What sort of person do I want to be? What sort of character do I want? So The difference being, if you ask those questions in a Christian context, we have a bit of a cheat sheet in the Bible. So we have some values that are pretty clear, like the fruits of the Spirit, for example, in Galatians, like they're listed.
Yeah.
I'll probably get them wrong, so I won't list them all out. But then we have in Corinthians, we have also the characteristics of what love is.
Yeah.
So love is patient, kind, and it keeps describing it. So when you think about values that direct who you are, they're a really great foundation to start on.
Yeah, okay.
Whereas a non-Christian would struggle, they'd have to work harder to think about it. But everyone's got a morality of some kind, ethics that they live by. And it's about trying to get those ideas or the values to line up with what we actually do. So if I give a concrete example, if I want to, if I think that loving God and loving people are the most important things, so just take something out of Jesus' teaching because it's very specific.
Yeah.
And in my life, I should be putting relationships ahead of a lot of other things that I do. And in those relationships, no matter who the person is, I need to be able to provide unconditional love to the people I meet. But I also need to be spending time with God as well, because loving God's the other part to the puzzle, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great example. And you can even take it a step further, where I think it's Paul who says, like, both those great commandments can be summarized into one, that we show our love for God by loving others. Yeah, that's great. So you talk like the book, I think overall, and you mentioned this at the start, is about stories and narratives, and you go into detail of that as well. Do you mind explaining maybe how does one go about rewriting a narrative they may have of themselves, or reimagining our own narratives?
So part of who we are as people, like we talk about ourself. So our self, part of that is our narrative or our story about who we are. And you could, if I asked you, Caleb, who you are, you'd probably be able to give me a story about what sort of person you are, but you also might talk to me about how you grew up, where you lived, and how you got to where you are in your life. So it's complex. It's all of those things. And sometimes our narratives get completely smashed up and distorted because of things we go through. And having a mental illness or a health condition, like in my case, I talk about chronic pain in the book, you can have your identity and narrative distorted by struggling through that. Some people find that they can't separate themselves from the illness that they have. And in the book, I talk a bit about, you aren't the thing that you're struggling with, and we need to have ways of trying to, where I talk about externalize, is a very therapy words that we use.
Yeah, right. What do you mean by externalize?
But it means trying to get some distance from something.
Yeah.
So if you feel completely immersed in it with your identity, you will just see yourself as that thing. So if I saw myself as my chronic pain and health condition, that would be catastrophic. Like, I am not defined by that. I'm not a walking disability. I am a person in my own right. There's so many other facets to who I am. So it's very limiting to sometimes get stuck in the problem. So in the book, I talk about my chronic pain as my problem, and trying to externalize and get some distance from the problem is the first step to trying to work out, well, who am I really? Are there other ways of understanding who I am? So trying to find different explanations and trying to be more flexible about how we see ourselves, finding different perspectives.
Right.
All of these things can be really helpful to find a way through if you get stuck with the problem.
Yeah. And how I'm struggling to see how, if you have, say, a problem like chronic pain where it's very much like a part of you, and then it's probably not going to go away until our bodies are redeemed. How do you externalize that when it's so near?
Yeah, so I guess it's partly about perspective. For me, I would say that's how I do it.
Right.
So I don't see myself as being defined or taken over by my pain. It's part of who I am, yes, because I can't get rid of my body to get rid of the pain. So there's a level of acceptance you need for your situation. But like when I got up this morning, I didn't think about my pain. The first thing I thought about when I woke up this morning was, I want to read whatever today's Bible passage is and to think about, God, what's happening today, and, how am I going to get through the things I have to do, and where are you going to be in that space?
Yeah.
And my day today has been about all sorts of other things, talking to people, and it's been about trying to write a lecture for next year for our course that we're doing. It's about my friends and family and all of those things. Like, I am not just a one-dimensional problem. I am all of these other positive things as well. And my pain doesn't have to drive my life or limit it in any way. And yes, it does limit it practically, but it doesn't have to stop me living. And I think that's how you get through to redeeming whatever the situation is. And I find like now it's an opportunity to share part of my struggle and journey and give other people hope. So
yeah, that's beautiful. It reminds me of have you heard of the Japanese art form kintsugi?
No.
No, so it's where they take broken vessels and they mend it with gold. And it's sort of beautiful, and it sounds like what you're describing is like where we are broken vessels, but then we are made whole, and you can see the gold threads of God mending us together. So where there was pain, the pain's still there, but you can see the imprint of God and how he's holding it together, and it changes perspective as well from something that's broken to something that's actually of immense value now.
Yeah, that's right. And in the book, I offer a whole lot of other ways of rethinking things so that you can get that distance from your story and get unstuck from being in it so that you can move forward. And we've got all sorts of wonderful stuff in our Christian tradition, like St. John of the Cross wrote about going through pain, and a lot of people that suffer read his work, even though it was written hundreds of years ago, it's still relevant. And we've got allegories that people have written, like the one everyone knows is Pilgrim's Progress, but
Right.
There's other ones that are out there, and The Shack is the most recent one. If people have watched the movie that got made of that book, which talks about going through pain as a Christian and going through periods of doubt.
Yeah.
And all of these tools are there for us. We just need to discover them so that they can teach us something.
Yeah. And when I was, because you talk about those different allegories, and the one that came to my mind while I was reading, and this is probably just more shows the stage of life that I am, but it's Do you know the children's book Going on a Bear Hunt?
Yeah, yeah.
So I had the connection. It's just like it's every time the family encounters a difficult situation in their life, there's a whole bunch of different ones. Like they come to a river, or they come to a forest, or like they come to mud. The only way they're able to resolve that is if they continue and they push through, and they resolve it by they have to go through it. And that seems like that's a common theme in your book, is like when you face adversity or pain or suffering, the best thing we can do is push into it or lean into it. What do you mean by that?
It means the willingness to be uncomfortable, I think, in its most simplistic.
Yeah.
Or to be okay about not having the answers, and to be okay about asking questions, even about who God is and who we are and what our faith's about. Because I think sometimes we get scared of that. We think that means we don't have faith. And I don't think that's what it means at all. I think it's when we have doubts and when we struggle through things, that's about being willing to grow. It's not about a failure of faith.
Yeah. And how, like, if someone, so that's amazing in terms of just an encouragement if people are experiencing it, and we all experience it at different stage. And if we know someone who's close to us that it is experiencing suffering, how do we best, I suppose, help or support? Or I know you mentioned sometimes it's just being with them in silence. What's an encouragement that you'd have for those, or just for anyone really, because we're all going to at some point, if not currently, have someone in our life or ourselves that are experiencing immense pain and suffering.
Yeah, I think the book of Job tells us what to do and what not to do if we patiently read it. His wife famously said, "Curse God and die," which was horrible.
Yeah.
A terrible thing to say to someone that's suffering. Don't do that. That's a what not to do. And then his friends were hopeless. Like they said, "Oh, you must have done something to deserve this," or, all the classic things.
I was going to say, yeah. Yeah.
Like, don't do that, and don't give advice. They tried to give advice.
Right.
And it's not helpful, and it didn't help. And I think we need to learn all those lessons. So what is helpful? I'll give you a different biblical image that I like because it's encouraging. So after Jesus died on the cross, and the disciples, you can imagine, because they didn't understand what was happening, he hadn't risen yet. They were devastated. So think about how you just invested 3 years of your life into following this guy around with his teaching, and then he's not there anymore. You would be devastated because everything would be completely smashed up. And the story about the road to Emmaus is that there's two followers of Jesus after he died on the cross that were going back home because they thought, well, that's probably the best thing to do now because everything's messed up. And then Jesus joins them on the walk. And I think that they don't realise until the end, when he breaks bread with them, that it was him that was with them and he'd risen from the dead.
Yeah.
And appeared to them, which would have blown their minds. But I think it's a beautiful image of what travelling through suffering as a Christian needs to be like. It is not doing it by yourself. You have other Christians supporting you. So you're not alone. So you've got your buddy with you and on the journey walking along. And then I think the third bit, which is lovely in that image, is that Christ is walking also with you. So you've got that wraparound support. Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And what would you say, is there any purpose in asking questions as you engage with someone, or is it best just to let them be?
What I'm learning as I get older is that silence is sometimes worth more than anything else.
Yeah.
And people take a very long time to be able to put into words what they're going through. And not saying something is often therefore more powerful than saying something and listening. So not giving your advice, like advice giving is usually terrible because it means you come across as you didn't really listen or care. So hold off on the advice and actually just either say nothing or say, what can I do to help you and support you? Or just simply listen to them and give them that time that they feel like someone actually cares.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think I'm inclined to want to, my personality is like, I don't like dealing with pain or suffering. So I think I try and, like, I've gone through a bunch of different stories of pain and suffering, but then when I try and think about it, I almost have forgotten. And I think it's because I try and like repress the memory. So then when I'm in the moment, I'm like, what can be done just to get away as far from this place as possible? But I love what you're saying is like, it's all right to be in that place. And it's actually very helpful and healthy to like accept that it might be a slow journey. It might take time. But you're going to be a lot better for it. And then I can apply that as well to, say, my relationship as well, where it's like I don't need to be the answer. I don't need to try and like, hey, look at the positive over here, which is so bad. But I'm so guilty of doing that. And I think as a friend of someone who's suffering, what I've learned, especially through reading your work, is that it's so helpful just to allow the space for someone to be there. And that's reminds me a lot of Jesus, who he is gentle and he is lowly, and part of his nature is he's found in brokenness. Like that's where he's found. And I can rely on his strength for myself to be like, okay, well, I can't do this on my own. I don't want to be the savior, but I want to be able to sit here and listen. So can you help me as well? Can you help me and give me what I need to just be with my partner, my wife, or my friend, or whoever it may be. So that's what I found really helpful from that. I think what you're saying is so true and so beautiful.
I think too, the other part of it, Caleb, is that what I learned from talking to the people I interviewed and through reflecting on what I was writing is that often if we go through deep suffering and pain for whatever reason, it forces us to go inwards. And so for a time we may look like we've become a bit withdrawn, less sociable, not able to explain what's going on. But what's happening is there's a lot happening inside the person because they're trying to process what's going on. And then often if they successfully get through that, they come back out again. And as Christians, it can come back out in the most amazing ways. Many of the people, which I don't really say this in the book, but they've gone on to do amazing stuff with ministry and, you know, they've come back out of their suffering and they haven't just stayed there. Because they've grown through it, they've then used it to help other people as well.
Yeah. And that's so true. I think of that redemption, part of the redemption story is there's that experience in the now as well, that we can experience it, or we can hope for it. What are your thoughts on hope in all of this? Is it important to have a hope while you're going through it? Is it, if you don't have a hope, how do you find one?
Yeah, Paul talks about how suffering creates in us perseverance, endurance, character, and then hope.
Yeah.
There's something that just leads to hope if you've gone through the process, because I think that our faith is intact, and it's complex, isn't it? Because it's not about whether our life gets magically fixed while we're here on earth living. Because for some of us, it's not going to go away. Like, it's just not possible. I don't think the hope comes from having the problem removed. I think the hope is something that comes because we are transformed, and the redemption brings the hope somehow. So we can be redeemed but still be in the suffering.
Yeah.
It's a really complicated question you've asked me. And I don't really have a full answer to it, but it's a mysterious part of the process of the discipline of suffering, I think.
Yeah. I think that does answer it like beautifully. There is a complexity to it than something that, we don't understand, but that's the mystery of the gospel, I suppose, or one of the mysteries of the gospel. That the other side of it as well, and you talk a bit about this, is that aspect of forgiveness. So what do you mean by having forgiveness in connecting to our well-being, or what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So if I grab a image we use in therapy sometimes, so if you hold on to anger or any variation of that for a long period of time, it's like you've got hot coals in your hands and you're choosing to hold on to it. Like, what sort of insanity is that? Why would you burn your hands willingly?
Right.
Like, if I picked up a hot coal, my body would instantly have the reaction of trying to drop it as quick as I can, and then trying to do something to get rid of the pain.
Yeah.
So with that image, it's a really good example of what happens to us emotionally and deep within our self if we don't let go of anger and we don't forgive people. It actually harms us. So that might sound selfish, but it's not always possible to reconcile with the person that's offended you or hurt you for lots of complicated reasons. Sometimes we can, which is great, because then the relationship's restored and redeemed. But it's not always possible. So I think Jesus in his teaching challenged us that we have to forgive. But in our church culture, we think forgiveness is just like making this decision like that. And it's not that simple. It's a process. And in the book, I sort of outline very briefly the steps that you might need to go through in order to complete the process. And part of it's being willing to face down the emotional pain that whatever the situation's caused for you, and then to eventually get through to the point where you can start to see the other person as an imperfect person, that whilst what they did was wrong, we're all capable of doing things to hurt people.
Very good, yeah.
So it doesn't excuse what they did, but we sort of come to this point where we're a bit more gracious and accepting of the situation, and then we have to choose to let it go. That's the hard bit.
Right, yeah. And that's, I think, having a relationship with God, it's still very hard, but it does make it doable and possible. Yeah. I think you've mentioned it a few times, so it's like this journey of hope is a process, journey of forgiveness is a process, the discipline of suffering is a process. And even in that wording, like discipline, I imagine like you're training for a race or something like that, where you have to like actively be practicing, and it doesn't happen overnight. I think that's very countercultural, especially in our time and age where we want and particularly my generation is where we want something and we want it now. How do you encourage someone, or how do you go about accepting that some things and a lot of things that are good for you just take time?
Yeah, I think as followers of Christ, we're little Christs. We're meant to be imitating his life. When we talk about spiritual disciplines, the word discipline is a bit grating, isn't it, in our culture, because we think that's work.
Right.
It's not meant to be interpreted that way. So, and you're right, Caleb. So if you wanted to play sport, you would have to train. If I want to get good at something, it could be something random, like I'm trying to think of something I do, like growing vegetables, like really random thing. Yeah. The first time you try to do it, you're going to be hopeless at it. It actually...
you end up with a bunch of weeds and
so
dried plants.
Yeah. And maybe that's a good example, because you have to weed around your vegetables. You can't neglect them. So it's back to this idea of choosing each day to take up our cross and follow Christ. The discipline of suffering is just one way we apply our faith to living each day intentionally, so that we're trying to be Christ-like.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think, just aware of time. I think if I could encourage people that are listening to go dig a bit deeper, I definitely, I don't usually promote books or anything with the authors I talk to, but I have found your book extremely helpful, and it's just a very pleasant read in the sense of it's relatable. I think the stories are a big part of that as well, and it's very helpful. So I'd encourage our listeners to, if they have the opportunity to go and grab a copy of The Discipline of Suffering. In closing, did you have any last bits of encouragement or thoughts on this area of suffering and pain that you'd like to leave us with or share with us?
The thing that comes to mind is that Brené Brown, who people know as a well-known author from the States, she talks about rumbling with our stories and choosing to wrestle with them is what she's talking about. And it's so important. It's countercultural, but so important for building character, and it requires courage. And in that, I think that I always think in the context of our suffering, Jesus died on the Friday, and then the Saturday is a strange place, isn't it, of nothingness. And I wonder if that's a helpful image of our suffering, because sometimes we get stuck in the Saturday and the redemption comes the following day on the Sunday with the resurrection. And so I just leave people with that image that even though the Saturday sometimes feels so long, it's worth rumbling with your story so that you can come out the other side, and eventually Sunday will come.
Very good. Yeah, that's beautiful. And I'm so encouraged by the mind that you have from a clinical side, and just you have that theoretical understanding and how you've synthesized the gospel message through your work and through your practice and through your book as well. It was like that for me as well is amazing, because I think so many Christians wrestle with their faith and don't have resources that are practical in that sense of how do we wrestle with these real life issues that we go through, whether it's depression or anxiety or relational breakdowns, and I think you provide a really gospel-centered answer to that. That's based in that theoretical, researched practice. So, yeah, encourage our listeners to go grab a copy, and they can grab a coffee as well, sit down, have a read with it. It's been great chatting with you, Katherine. Thanks so much for taking the time. I feel like I could have another conversation very easily because, there's just a depth of knowledge that you have that I'd love to tap into. So love to have another conversation at some point and have you on again. So hopefully you've enjoyed yourself.
Yeah, I have. Thanks, Caleb. Pleasure.
Thanks, Katherine.